before the events that unfolded on that fateful day, her life had been a symbol of pride and beauty. Her hair, cascading down to her feet, was not just a part of her, it was her identity. Every morning, she'd spend hours caring for it, applying oils and brushing each strand until it shone. Her nephew Ansu often teased her, saying that her hair was more precious to her than anything else in the world. The neighborhood admired her, people would stop and ask her for hair tips, and she reveled in the attention. She loved the way her hair made her feel special, different from others. She had no intention of changing that. When Anshu, 22, warned her that day, she simply laughed it off. "Auntie, if you don't cut your hair today, you'll cry tomorrow," Anshu had said with a mix of playfulness and concern in his voice. She, at 36, smirked, running her fingers through her long jet black locks, and replied, "Why would I cry? This hair is my pride, my beauty."
You're just jealous.
Anshu shook his head, knowing his aunt's stubborn nature. "I'm just telling you. Don't say I didn't warn you." His words hung in the air as he left, but she dismissed them, continuing to admire her reflection in the mirror. The next day, her nephew returned, this time with his cousin Sonali, who had been away for a while. Sonali, 25, had always looked up to her aunt, admiring her long hair as a child. But as soon as she saw Sonali, a strange feeling crept into her chest. Sonali's hair, now reaching her waist, was smooth, silky, and undeniably beautiful, though not as long as hers. There was something about Sonali's hair that drew attention. Jealousy sparked within her, a feeling she hadn't anticipated. She invited Sonali to the rooftop, masking her envy with a smile. "Come, let's catch up." "I've missed you," she said. Sonali smiled, unaware of her aunt's intentions, and followed her up the stairs. As they reached the rooftop, she gestured towards the chair she had placed near the edge. It was an old salon chair she had used on her family for years, styling their hair with grace and skill. But today it was different. "Why don't you sit down?" she suggested casually. Sonali hesitated, looking at her aunt curiously. "Are you sure? I've been growing it out for a year. I don't want to cut it," she forced a smile. "Oh no, just a trim. You trust me, right?" Sonali hesitated, her fingers nervously running through her waist-length hair. "I don't want anything drastic, just a little trim to keep it healthy," she said softly, her eyes filled with uncertainty. The woman standing behind her, scissors in hand, looked at her niece with a calm but calculated gaze. "It's just a trim," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. "Sit down, don't worry," Sonali bit her lip, but then reluctantly nodded, sitting down in the chair. "Okay, but please, nothing too short. I've been growing it for so long," halfway through the conversation. Manisha, at 36, her voice laced with subtle impatience, replied, "You know how I am with hair, Sonali. Trust me. Just let me do my magic." But Sonali's instincts were telling her something wasn't right. She turned slightly to look at her aunt. "I really don't want much off, Auntie. I just want to grow it long like yours." Sonali, 25, said, her voice now slightly firmer, holding her ground. Manisha's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Sonali," her voice dropped. "You're being difficult. It's just hair." The tension in the air thickened. Sonali, noticing the change in her aunt's demeanor, stood up abruptly. "No, I think I'll just wait." "I'm not feeling it today," she said, trying to move away from the chair, but Manisha grabbed her arm, her grip tight. "Sit down, Sonali," she said sternly. "You don't get to decide now." Sonali's heart raced, her eyes wide with alarm. "What are you doing?" "Let me go," she demanded, struggling against her aunt's hold. Manisha pushed her back into the chair forcefully. "You think your hair makes you better than me, don't you?" she hissed. "You think you can grow it longer, prettier, and I'm just supposed to sit by and watch?" Sonali's voice shook as she tried to push her aunt away. "No, I never thought that. Please, Auntie, don't do this." But it was too late. Manisha grabbed a chunk of Sonali's hair and brought the scissors close. Sonali screamed, her voice filled with desperation. "No, stop, please." The sharp sound of scissors slicing through hair filled the air, and Sonali's cries grew louder. "Please, Auntie. I'm begging you. Don't cut it all." Manisha, ignoring her pleas, kept cutting. A manic look in her eyes as long strands of Sonali's beautiful hair fell to the floor. You think you can outshine me, Sonali? This is what happens when you try. Manisha muttered, her hand moving faster with each snip. Tears streamed down Sonali's face as she saw the damage being done. Please stop. You're ruining it, she sobbed, her voice barely audible through the crying. Just then, Anshu, having heard the commotion, burst into the room. What the hell is going on here? He shouted, his face filled with shock and anger. But no one answered immediately. The woman standing in front of Sonali turned around, gripping the scissors tightly in her hand, her expression filled with panic and guilt. Anshu's eyes darted to the floor, where strands of Sonali's long, beautiful hair lay scattered. Sonali, her face wet with tears, choked on her words. She cut my hair. I told her not to, Anshu. I didn't want this. Sonali, 25, sobbed, clutching the uneven remains of her hair with trembling hands. Anshu's fists clenched at his sides. What were you thinking? He shouted at his aunt, stepping closer. You promised her just a trim. The woman tried to steady her breathing, her voice shaky. I was just trying to help. She needed to see that long hair isn't everything. She stammered, her eyes darting from Anshu to Sonali. Anshu's voice was ice cold. You call this helping? Look at what you've done. His gaze shifted back to Sonali, who was still in shock, running her fingers through what was left of her once glorious hair. Desperate to defend herself, she spoke up, her voice rising. She's young, Anshu. She doesn't understand what it takes to maintain hair like that. I was trying to protect her from disappointment, from the burden of Anshu cut her off sharply. Stop justifying it. You didn't do this for her. You did it because you were jealous. You couldn't stand the thought of her hair growing longer than yours. Her face flushed, and she shook her head. That's not true. I just wanted to. But Sonali interrupted this time, her voice breaking as she wiped away her tears. You wanted to control me, just like you always do. You always want everything your way. Silence hung in the room, heavy and uncomfortable. The woman's face tightened with frustration. But she said nothing. She knew deep down that Sonali's words cut through the lie she had been telling herself. And she took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. He turned to Sonali and spoke gently. Come here, Sonali, we'll get this fixed. Don't worry. He extended a hand, but Sonali stood still, staring at the broken pieces of her hair on the floor. Her voice was barely a whisper. It'll never be the same. Anshu's eyes softened as he approached her, pulling her into a hug. It's just hair. It'll grow back. But what she did, that's different. Sonali nodded slowly, still struggling to come to terms with what had happened. Anshu turned back to his aunt. His face hardened again. You need to apologize now. She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped, the weight of her actions sinking in. I'm sorry, Sonali, she whispered, her eyes downcast. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Sonali looked at her aunt, hurt and disappointment etched into her face. It doesn't matter anymore. Anshu placed a hand on Sonali's shoulder, guiding her toward the door. Let's go, Sonali. You don't need to hear any more of this. As they walked out, leaving the broken trust and shattered hair behind, the woman stood in the room alone, staring at the strands of hair scattered on the ground. The weight of her jealousy pressed down on her chest, heavier than ever. Manisha sank into the chair, her reflection staring back at her from the mirror, but this time all she could see was the emptiness of her own choices.